Welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com, hosted by Mark Angelides.
In the last edition of The Rabbit Hole, we discussed tyrants throughout history and what their motivations might have been. We examined the life of General William Walker and his war campaign to become the President of Nicaragua, and of course at the actions of Gretchen Whitmer, the Governor of Michigan. This week I want to look at individuals who have tried to carve out their own minor kingdoms of either land or influence, and perhaps show that the heart of man, despite technology, despite millennia of civilization, has not really changed. Thucydides, the Athenian historian and general, gave us an account of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century BC. But he also talked of the motivations of the men involved. He wrote, quote, "Its leaders committed appalling atrocities in order to pursue their own interests, while pretending to cherish public interests, embracing any means in their struggles for supremacy." End quote. These words, 2,500 years old, they could be written today, right? Consider Julius Caesar. In Plutarch's book of his life, he describes what's known as the Lupercalia incident, which involved, while sitting on a throne overlooking the festivities, Mark Antony carrying a diadem, which is like a laurel wreath, but it's symbolic of a crown. He came up to Caesar and he offered the crown to Caesar, who was gauging the onlookers' responses. Now Caesar refused it a first time, and the audience applauded that refusal. Antony tried again to offer it, and again Caesar demurred. And yet again, a third time, with the crowd erupting in cheers that Rome's greatest citizen would refuse to be a king. Plutarch writes, quote, "Caesar, finding that the experiment had proved a failure, rose from his seat and ordered the wreath to be carried to the Capitol." End quote. Now, there are many modern interpretations that argue Caesar did not really want to take the crown, but rather that it was a symbolic gesture to show his rejection of kingships. However, writing at the time, Cicero, who's surely one of the period's most captivating sources, decried Antony's role in the event, saying, "Where did you get the crown? You didn't just find it lying there. You bought it from home, a premeditated and carefully planned crime," he wrote. Then he shows us how Caesar was such a master manipulator that even when things went wrong, he could still spin them to his favor. Quote, "Caesar even ordered an inscription in the official record, 'At the Lupercalia, when the consul Mark Antony offered the kingship to Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator for life, by the order of the people, Caesar said that he did not want it.'" End quote. Of course, then as now, there are many ways to skin a cat, and Julius Caesar did have the powers he craved, just perhaps not the title. And what of more modern attempts at grabbing power? The son of the legendary British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Mark Thatcher, got himself involved in some filibustering of his own in 2004. In what is now widely known as the Wonga coup, Wonga being a British slang term for cash, Thatcher and several of his well-to-do friends attempted a coup d'etat in Equatorial Guinea. Mercenaries were sent in to try and oust the president, the point being to install a new leader who had agreed to give Thatcher and his cohorts preferential oil rights. The plot failed, and after multiple prosecutions, Mark Thatcher received a hefty fine and a 4-year suspended sentence for his financial backing of this takeover. As you know, the power plays nowadays are more to do with financial interest and control rather than actual territory grabs. So we've seen tyrants come and go, but what of the invisible tyrants? What of those who work behind the scenes to make politics more of a stage show than many already perceive it to be? In 2011, the Russian billionaire Mikhail Prokhorov talked about how Russian politics was essentially a theatre production put on by one man. Quote, "There is a puppet master in this country who long ago privatized the political system, puts pressure on the media, and tries to manipulate citizens' opinions. This puppet master is named Vladislav Surkov. As long as people like him control the process, politics is impossible." End quote. No ordinary spin doctor, Vladislav Surkov. He's been the mind behind the machine in Russian politics for many years, and his scope, influence and powers of control are almost too great to be considered real. Hired by Boris Yeltsin, Surkov became known as the puppet master or the Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin. Through various channels he founded and funded groups of young anti-fascists and also groups of young angry nationalists. He supported whole political parties but set them up to fail. He created crisis after crisis, all to make the Russian people demand stability and order. And this is ostensibly what they got in the form of Vladimir Putin. The country was put to the torch in order to maintain what can only be described as the deep state. Surkov's background as a theatre director probably came in handy, as he played all the strings of the political orchestra. Of course, when it became known about the depth of his influence and the power plays he had put together, you would think that other countries would start casting a more suspicious eye at their own backyards. But it appears not. It's quite an east-west distinction on how political puppet masters operate. In the USSR and present-day Russia, these bad faith actors are within the government. They're seated so deeply that they span administrations, always pulling the levers to work with the pre-selected leader. But in Western democracies, very few people would openly support such an arrangement. Instead, the West has big money donors who influence politics in just as brazen a way, but are one step removed. Take George Soros, for example. It would be difficult to argue that his cash injections have not been a guiding influence in almost all Western nations. From funding voting initiatives to bankrolling district attorneys across the United States, his reach is long. But he is shielded. It seems that to even mention the name George Soros invites accusations of anti-Semitism from the media, and this media machine is only too willing to have the fabric of the nation soiled by outsider cash interest. And what of Bill Gates? The Microsoft founder is now the single largest donor to the World Health Organization. The US formerly was, contributing around 15% to the annual budget, and with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation a close second on 9.8%. But with Trump pulling American funding, who now has the biggest say in what happens to the arbiter of world health? There is no doubt whatsoever that the WHO has become politically tainted. But again, we in the West seem not to mind when it comes from outside philanthropists, even though they have the power and the sway of the most ardent of tyrants. As for the United Kingdom, it suffers from the worst excesses of both systems, a built-in deep statism and outside influences. Foundations and philanthropists are ostensibly looking to make what they consider positive social changes on one side and the civil service on the other. Now, the civil service is a misnomer on both counts. It's neither civil nor in fact a particularly good service. And politicians come and go, but the service remains and appears determined to follow in its own agenda. In 1980 there began what is regarded as one of the most impressive comedy sitcoms of all time, Yes Minister, and of course its sequel, Yes Prime Minister, in which a newly elected member of parliament has to do battle with the entrenched civil service. The show was considered an amusing but a somewhat over-the-top depiction of the interaction between ministers and the civil servants at the time. Sadly, it has stood the test of time, and now seems almost prophetic in its vision. It seems that these power plays are becoming more common and are less frowned upon by those who wield the power themselves. Buying elections merely results in a fine or, if successful, a knighthood, and the globalist players are lauded for exerting their influence in less developed nations, almost as if empire building was okay as long as you have the woke credentials. But we should not merely step back and allow these events and plots to occur without question. It's by opposing even if the opposition is unsuccessful, that we stem the tide. C.S. Lewis wrote, quote, "When the whole world is running toward a cliff, he who is running in the opposite direction appears to have lost his mind." End quote. As with all the manifestations of the supposedly unstoppable race to progress, it's the individuals who stem the flow. It's the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dam, the brave whistleblower who risks all for the truth. These are the people that shape history. Perhaps we could all benefit from carving out our own special place in the ever-growing tree of civilization.
Go deeper on the topic discussed in this video, head on over to one of these links here or go to our Liberty Nation Roku channel. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for Liberty.
The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. Available at Libsyn, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, on Roku, and other fine podcast providers.